Good morning, everyone. I like Steve Martin. There's an old bit from a long time ago, probably even before I was born, where Steve Martin plays the absent-minded waiter. And I don't know if anybody's seen this bit, but I'll try to describe it for you in just a minute or so. So you've got Steve Martin, who's a waiter, and he goes up to this table, and he's got a dessert cart, right? And he's trying to get the people to order dessert. And he's showing them all the different desserts that they have and everything else, and the couple is looking at them, and the couple hasn't even ordered their food yet. They're sitting there, they have not even ordered, they still have waters on the table, and he's trying to get them to order dessert. And at some point in the conversation, when the husband and the wife are trying to explain to Steve Martin, listen, we haven't even ordered our food yet, Steve Martin just stops. And he looks off into space. And it just sits there with an uncomfortable amount of time on Steve Martin as he's just looking off into space. And then he says, "I'm sorry, I just went to the Bahamas." And it's just the dumbest moment in one of the dumbest little skits that I've seen. But I want to just lay it all out there. I have, in conversations with my friends, gone to the Bahamas. Have you ever gone to the Bahamas when you're talking to somebody? Have you ever, when you're having a conversation with somebody, have you ever just drifted off into la la land? And I'm just bringing this up at the outset of this sermon because I know I'm going to be up here for at least 30 minutes, if not possibly more, and you may very well be tempted to go to the Bahamas while I'm talking. We as people struggle to listen. We struggle to maintain attention. And we struggle not only just in a sermon or when we're listening to a Zoom call for work or a PTO meeting at school. No, we do this even in intimate relationships with our friends. And I've been talking over the last few lessons in this little series that I'm doing called 2 by 2. I've been talking about friendship and the value and the importance of friendship, how we need to make space and time for our friends, how we need to make sure that we're being friends with all kinds of different people, looking outside of our typical, normal bubbles of people to be friends with. In our last conversation, we were talking about love and how love is like the super glue that binds a relationship together. But another important and absolutely critical aspect of friendship is listening. Listening is critical to a friendship. Listening allows us to have with that person, with that other person, a dialogue. And if you've ever thought about good conversations, where the conversation goes back and forth and back and forth, a good conversation is a lot like a friendship. Friends give and they take, right? This is very unlike the fact that we're experiencing at this moment, right? What if this were a friendship? What if this moment here were like a friendship where you sat and you were experiencing my words being downloaded into your ear holes this morning and you don't get a chance to talk? Right? That would be equivalent to what I've called the friendship filibuster. Have you ever had a friend who just won't stop talking? A sermon is kind of like that, right? So I wish we could have this kind of discussion like in a Bible class where we could all have these we could all provide our feedback and input, because that would be more like a friendship, right? A friendship is a back and a forth. A friendship is not like a sermon in which one person speaks and the other person hears it and says nothing in response. But listening is so important to our friendships that we need to develop the skill to listen. Obviously, we know James chapter 1, verse 19, we ought to be quick to hear and slow to speak. You can go to passages like the wisdom literature in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, where the wise writer says, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Hearing and listening is so important. And on the heels of our adult Bible class out here in the auditorium and in some of the other classes for the little ones, we talked today about some people who jumped to conclusions. And it is so dangerous when friends don't heed this verse, when friends don't hear an answer before they give their answer, when friends don't evaluate and listen and tune in before they jump to a conclusion. It is absolutely their folly and shame. Can we go to a passage that I think exemplifies this pretty well? And that's in Job chapter 13. Really, the whole relationship that Job has with his friends. Job is going through a lot. And his friends are talking a lot. But his friends are not listening to him. And at some point in their conversation, in Job 13, verse 5, Job has to say, "Oh, that you would keep silent, and it would be your wisdom. Hear now my argument, and listen to the pleading of my lips." You ever been in a friendship where maybe in a friendship filibuster kind of situation, you just in frustration, like Job said, "Stop talking and listen to me"? Friendships where we don't listen can be frustrating. And Job exemplifies this here in this chapter. Job needs his friends to hear him and to listen to him and to tune into what he's saying. We see this same thing pop up in Job chapter 16. In Job 16, verse 2, he says, "I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? Shall windy words have an end?" Just such flowery, fragrant language for what we've all probably experienced before in our lives. Where somebody who we care about, who we love very deeply, who is so intimately connected to us, won't listen to us. They won't stop talking. Friendship based without listening. A friendship cannot exist without listening. A friendship that does not have listening is a friendship that is soon to crumble and fail. Imagine a relationship with your God where you never talked to God in prayer. We understand the value of prayer, right? We understand that prayer and our communication with God, not that God needs to hear anything from us, but it is based on our love for God that we speak to him and we ask for things and we call on him and cast our cares at his feet. That communication is critical. What about in a marriage? In a marriage, if you and your spouse refuse to talk to each other, or if it was only ever one-sided, where one person talked to the other person, that would not last long. And in a friendship where friends can't communicate back and forth and back and forth, there's not going to be a long-lasting friendship there for too long. Listening is absolutely one of the purest forms of love and connection that binds a friendship together. That's the whole idea in this lesson. Love is super important. As we talked about in our last conversation, love is like the super glue that binds a relationship together. But when you love somebody, you listen to them. You tune in to them. You hear what is going on, and you connect with them in deeper and deeper ways. And so listening is absolutely important. Can we go to John chapter 8 for a minute? Because I think it's super helpful for us, as Lance read for us, John chapter 8. I think it's super helpful for us to look to the master teacher for guidance on how to become good listeners. Before we dive into John chapter 8, though, there's a couple things I want to say. I would also love to have spent time this morning looking into John chapter 4. John chapter 4 is one of the most beautiful examples of Jesus in conversation in all the Bible, in my opinion. When Jesus sits with the Samaritan woman at the well, and they have a dialogue, a back and a forth. He asks her questions, she asks him questions, they answer each other, they talk back and forth. They're not fast friends. They're not, long-lasting friends. It's not like she'll be there at the crucifixion later on or following him around. But for the time that they have together, Jesus listens to her. And she listens to him. And that is a mark of a close relationship. But when we come here to John chapter 8, one other thing that I need to say is that a lot of people have said a lot of things about John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11. This section was likely not in the original manuscripts of John. And for us to go to this section of Scripture and try to pull out some deep theological truths may be a misstep. We may be going too far. But a lot of scholars, and I believe too, that John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, if this were not in the original account, doesn't it seem very, very in step with what we know about Jesus and the way that he taught? It is so Jesus. It is so typical Jesus. And it is so typical the religious leaders of Jesus' day. There's a lot I think we can learn from this section of Scripture, but I do just need to say, have a little caveat and an asterisk before we begin this conversation to remind us all or let us all know that this section of Scripture may not have actually been in the original manuscripts of John. But all of that being said, what does Jesus do here? As Jesus is there and he's at the temple, all the people are bringing this woman who was caught in adultery. We read this story here at the beginning of our worship hour. And they want to trap Jesus. They're trying to get Jesus to trip up in what he says. Oh, Jesus, what should we do with this woman she's been caught in adultery? Should we stone her? And they're trying to get Jesus to mess up. And Jesus is not going to be tricked. Jesus is not going to allow them to trap him in some way. And so he just sits on the ground and writes in the dirt with his finger. Jesus doesn't jump up and have a 4-point, 3-sub-point sermon that he's writing on a bed sheet, up on the wall or something like that. Like he's not doing some typical, rabbi thing. What is he doing? He's perfectly silent. And he's writing on the ground. And I don't know what he's writing. There's a lot of speculation. What's Jesus writing? Who knows? Right? Doesn't matter. If it mattered, we would know. We don't know what he's writing there, but all we know is that he's giving them time and space to work some things out on their own. And then he speaks up. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Boom. I mean, I wish John would have recorded boom at the end of that section, right? Because that for me, that's the mic drop moment. That's the this is what you need to know moment. And Jesus just says one small thing. And what does he then go do? He goes right back to writing on the ground again. What's he writing, everybody? I don't know. It doesn't matter. And as he sits there and he gives them time and space to work things out, eventually they all leave. And eventually all he's left with is just him and this woman. And he talks to her and has this conversation, doesn't condone her sin, but sends her off to go and sin no more. Jesus shows mercy and grace and kindness to this woman. But I want us to see in this story, in the context of our discussion about listening, silence is golden. Sometimes we have lots and lots of words to add to some situation, to try to help somebody work through something, to try to describe for somebody what's going on, when what we should be doing is just keeping our mouth shut and listening and being open for others to process what's going on. I gave the men of this congregation a kind of a hard time on my last lesson about love in friendship how sometimes we as guys struggle with this on our own, can I also just say that sometimes we as guys feel like we just have to give the answer for everything when somebody just wants us to hear them? Guys, have your wives ever wanted you just to listen rather than to try to solve the entire situation? Listening is powerful. Listening gives somebody the space to think through things, and just being present with somebody, just being there, which is actually, by the way, how Job and his friends started their interaction. Do you remember that? Back in the beginning of the book of Job, when all the things that happened, what do? They just sit there around the fire, silent. And then at some point after somebody started talking, they wouldn't stop talking, and finally Job has to throw up his hands and say, "Can you guys stop talking now?" Silence is important, and silence, if you want to look at the toolbox of Jesus, silence was absolutely in Jesus' toolbox. And it ought to be in ours as well. You ever been in a situation where you don't need to talk about stuff? You don't need to small talk or shoot the breeze, or you don't need to talk about the weather. Yeah, there's weather outside. There's always weather outside. Get over it. Right? The sports ball teams are playing right now. Get over it. We all know. Like sometimes it's just in a relationship, in a friendship particularly, sometimes embrace the silence. Sometimes we need to show love and show the fact that we're showing up for somebody by just sitting there and being quiet. And Jesus does this. Jesus uses this powerful tool here in his arsenal. I think we need to as well. Can we now go back to 1 Samuel, please? 1 Samuel chapter 1 is where we'll kind of continue and maybe close out the lesson here from 1 Samuel chapter 1. I want to look at this story because as Jesus shows us the example of being quiet, I think we also see a really powerful example of listening in our friendship from 1 Samuel chapter 1. And this is a really cool story. We've talked about it not too long ago in our Bible classes. But we have this woman named Hannah. And Hannah, well, she really wants a child. She wants a child so much that her sister wife, Peninnah, the other wife of her husband, she's just having kids all over the place, right? She's popping out children left and right. Hannah can't have any kids, and Hannah is so upset and frustrated. And I love in verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Elkanah, stop talking, right? Stop talking, Elkanah. You have no idea what you're saying. You're not listening to Hannah. You're not listening to her needs and what's going on with her. You are not more to her than 10 sons, just so you're aware. Guys, we can be Elkanah from time to time, right? In our friendships, sometimes we can be Elkanah who stick our big size 12s in our mouths sometimes. Listening would have been a better tact for Elkanah. But no, she's grieved and she goes out as the story continues. As this great feast is happening, she goes out, she's deeply distressed, and she sits by the doorposts of the temple, and she is praying to God for a child. She wants a son. And she's praying to herself, quietly to God. She's praying, and who sees her off at a distance? Eli. Eli sees Hannah praying, and what does Eli do? He jumps to conclusions, right? He jumps to the conclusion. And what does Eli think that Hannah is doing? I'm sure Eli has seen plenty of people after a party who got a little bit too intoxicated and now they're out there drunk. Is Hannah drunk? Absolutely not. And as he comes up to her and starts talking to her, his response in verse 14, Eli said to her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put wine away from you." So Eli jumps to conclusions about Hannah. Eli is not reading the situation clearly. and he thinks she's drunk. And the minute that Hannah starts opening her mouth and explaining to her her great anxiety and vexation, Eli comes to realize, whoops, I made a mistake. I jumped to conclusions about you. I wasn't reading the situation clearly. I was not listening to you. Had I listened to you, I would have known that you weren't drunk. In fact, you are probably, and I'm putting a lot of words in Eli's mouth here, but I think Eli at this moment is probably thinking, you may very well be the most holy and godly woman I have ever met in my life. At this moment, Eli can see that Hannah needs a blessing and not a rebuke or a cursing. And in verse 17, Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went on her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. After this conversation, he listened, he heard her plea, and he blessed her. And she said thank you, and she went on her way, and her attitude was changed. And what happens to her? She has a son. She has a son named Samuel, and she dedicates Samuel to the Lord. And what I learned from this lesson is that it is so easy to jump to conclusions. It is a lot harder to tune in and listen to why you might be wrong. It is so easy in our friendships, in our deep and close relationships. It is so easy to not give somebody the benefit of the doubt. It is so easy to assume negative intent about somebody and what somebody is doing. It is so easy to just throw somebody by the wayside, throw somebody under the bus and think you know. Are you willing, though, to do like Eli did and find out why you might actually be wrong? Because what a great blessing it is that Eli finally did listen. He jumped to some wrong conclusions, absolutely, and we've all done that. Have you ever jumped to the wrong conclusion about somebody? I think all of us do. We're not perfect. We're not Jesus. We don't see into people's hearts, and you know what we all are to each other sometimes? We are an iceberg. You know what I mean by that, right? We're an iceberg to each other. When you look at my life, what do you see about my life? Just a little tip that's sitting above the surface of the water. But underneath the surface of the water, there is a whole bunch of stuff you don't know about. And you're that way to me. And there are a lot of times where we look at the little tip on the iceberg and we say, oh, I've got that person figured out. I got Mike Abney figured out, right? I got him all. I got him pegged, right? I know exactly who Mike Abney is. You know, I know exactly who Jason Amelong is. I know exactly who Gigi is. But you don't so often. And like Eli, sometimes we need to dig a little deeper and to get into conversation with people and understand what's going on and draw them out, even in their moment of anxiety, even when it seems so obvious on the surface that we've got it figured out and we know the answers. No, maybe you don't. And for somebody like Eli to then turn around and bless her rather than get after her, we need to take that lesson too. How quickly can we change our approach when we think we know the answer about why somebody is the way that they are? And for a friendship, that is absolutely important. For a friendship, we just need to ask ourselves, I think, and maybe this is a conversation to have with a friend, how has poor listening impacted your friendships? I mean, let's stop looking at, the examples of people from the past, right? Think about your own life. How has it felt when somebody wouldn't listen to you? When somebody wasn't curious about what was going on with you enough to ask or enough to get deep with you? How has that felt? Does that feel good? Does it connect you with somebody? No, it does not. Absolutely does not. But how has that made you feel, or how has that impacted your relationships? Are you really close, fast, deep friends with somebody who really just doesn't care about anything except for the tip of the iceberg? I think our deep friends, I think our close friends, our connected inner circle are the people who want to grab the rest of the iceberg but like a bull by the horns. Like they don't care. It doesn't bother them. They're not afraid of it. They're not afraid of your past. They're not afraid of what's going on with you now. They're not afraid of your insecurities. They're not afraid of the fact that you don't have it all figured out. No, they're not afraid of those things because they love you. And that's why the last lesson about love and friendship ties to this one. Because listening is actually not very easy, as I'm sure you are all grappling with at this moment. Anyone in the Bahamas yet? Listening is not easy, because sometimes focus, especially in our modern society, eludes us. Getting into some deep and challenging kinds of things makes our toes uncomfortable as they're constantly being stepped on. Imagine the people in the Sermon on the Mount who were all sitting there on a mount. The sermon was on a mountain. Like, it couldn't have been that comfortable. And they're all there listening to this amazing sermon in which they just keep getting poked in the eye over and over and over again. How comfortable would that have been? How comfortable would it have been to be a friend to somebody who's going through a lot? How has poor listening impacted your friendships? But then on the other side of that, think about a time when somebody has heard you. You ever have a friend like that? I hope you do. I hope you've had a friend who has just heard you, who sat and listened to you, who has just understood that, listen, I don't need to know all the details, but I love you and I trust that no matter what, you're still my friend. Somebody who's committed to that relationship. How has good listening impacted your relationships? And while it's nice to think about somebody listening to us, really the motivation, really the challenge of this entire lesson is not to find people who will listen to us, but to be a good listener for others. So that's the challenge, really. If you want to take on a challenge this week for this lesson, I encourage you to get curious about your friends' lives. To get curious about each other, not just what's on the surface, but what's going on underneath. Get curious, and then listen up. Don't go to the Bahamas. Don't check out. Put your phone down and listen. Listen to what is going on in the lives of other people around you. We are never going to be bonded like a family until we have conversations that matter with each other. You agree? You believe that? The more we can just talk about the weather, talk about the sports ball, talk about whatever it else is that's going on, those things can be important, absolutely, but can we get deeper with our friends? Can we nurture these relationships? So your challenge, should you choose to accept it, is to ask good questions this week and sit and listen to the answers. I think it's such an easy thing for us to do, right? You don't have to have a 5-point sermon with like 4 subpoints or whatever written all out on a bed sheet somewhere to put up for somebody. No, you just have to be quiet. And for some of us, that's a little harder to do than others. And that's my time. So thanks so much, everyone, for your participation. Well, you didn't really participate in verbally, and that's the whole point, right? But thank you for not checking out. Thank you for leaving the Bahamas and sticking with me. And you're now welcome to go back to the Bahamas here after we sing our closing song. So if there's anyone here this morning who needs to give your life to the Lord and you haven't already, this is a great opportunity for you to join the Lord's family. If we can pray for you and help you and offer our support for you, this morning, we'd love to do that as well. But please come as we stand.